The first note screeched, and they smiled. Just as planned. Westwood Academy had rules, traditions, hierarchies, and Caleb Williams, with his second-hand uniform and scholarship status, was never meant to rise above his station. The recital trap was perfectly set, humiliate the boy who dared to believe he belonged among them. But in that moment of calculated cruelty, something dangerous awakened. His eyes closed, his posture shifted. The next note pierced the air with shocking perfection. What followed wasn't just music, it was vengeance. As his melody built to impossible heights, faces paled with recognition. They hadn't invited a student to perform. They'd provoked a prodigy, and now, note by devastating note, he would dismantle everything they thought they knew about power, talent, and who deserves to be heard. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's special episode is one you definitely don't want to miss. The first rays of dawn crept through the thin curtains of the small apartment as Caleb Williams opened his eyes. It was 5:30 a.m., a full hour before his alarm was set to ring. He didn't mind. These quiet morning hours belonged to him and his violin. Caleb slipped out of bed, careful not to make a sound that might wake his mother sleeping in the next room. Their apartment wasn't large, just 2 bedrooms, a kitchenette, and a living area that doubled as a dining room, but it was filled with remnants of their family history. Photos lined the walls, Caleb's grandfather in his Sunday best holding, a gleaming violin, his mother Naomi at her high school graduation, Caleb himself, age 6, holding a violin that seemed too big for his small frame. He moved to the corner of his bedroom where his grandfather's violin case sat atop his desk. The case was weathered, its leather cracked in places, with a faded name tag that read William Williams alongside several old concert programs tucked into a side pocket. Caleb ran his fingers over the name tag before carefully opening the case. The violin inside wasn't new or expensive, but to Caleb, it was priceless. His grandfather had played this very instrument in jazz clubs across the city decades ago, creating music that made people dance and cry in equal measure. Now it was Caleb's turn to make it sing. He positioned the violin under his chin, closed his eyes, and began to play. The notes of Bach's Partita No. 2 filled the small room as his fingers danced across the strings with practiced precision. For these few moments, Caleb wasn't a scholarship student at an elite school where he didn't belong. He was simply a musician lost in his craft. The smell of fresh coffee and toast eventually pulled him back to reality. Caleb carefully returned the violin to its case and made his way to the kitchen, where Naomi was already preparing breakfast. "Morning, Mom," Caleb said, giving her a quick kiss on the cheek. "Morning, baby." Naomi's smile was warm, though Caleb didn't miss the worried crease between her brows as she quickly tucked a stack of bills under a cookbook. "You're up early again." "Wanted to get some practice in before school," he said, sliding into his chair. At the small table, Naomi placed a plate of toast and eggs in front of him. "You know what time it is," she said, taking her own seat. Caleb smiled. This was their morning ritual, sharing one positive thought to start the day. "I finally nailed that tricky passage in the Bach Partita," he offered. Naomi's eyes lit up. "That's wonderful, Caleb. I knew you would." "Your turn," he prompted, taking a bite of toast. "My positive thought is the same as always," she said, reaching across to squeeze his hand. "You're going to do great things, Caleb Williams. Your music is going to take you places nobody in our family has ever been." Caleb squeezed back, not mentioning that some of those places, like Westwood Academy, didn't always feel welcoming. 30 minutes later, Caleb stood at the bus stop, his backpack slung over one shoulder. Inside were his school books, carefully covered to protect them, and several sheets of handwritten music that he'd been working on during lunch breaks. The school bus arrived with a squeal of brakes, and Caleb climbed aboard. The bus was already half full of Westwood students. Caleb made his way down the aisle, aware of how conversations quieted as he passed. The students with their pristine uniforms and expensive watches pointedly looked away or whispered behind their hands. Caleb found an empty seat near the back and sat alone, as he did every morning. Through the window, he watched as Westwood Academy came into view. The school was an imposing structure of gray stone and ivy, with manicured grounds surrounding it like a protective moat. Generations of wealthy, privileged students had walked through its halls, their legacy evident in the portraits that lined the corridors, faces of successful alumni staring down at current students with high expectations. Not one of those portraits showed a face that looked like Caleb's. The bus pulled to a stop, and Caleb joined the stream of students flowing toward the entrance. His uniform, second-hand but meticulously pressed by Naomi, was identical to everyone else's, yet somehow he still stood out. He straightened his tie and headed to his first class of the day, English with Ms. Pennington. The classroom was already filling up when Caleb arrived. He took his usual seat near the back, removed his notebook and pen, and prepared for class. Ms. Pennington, a thin woman with graying hair pulled into a tight bun, began discussing their current novel, The Great Gatsby. Who can tell me what Fitzgerald is suggesting about the American dream through Gatsby's pursuit of Daisy? She asked, her gaze sweeping across the room. Caleb raised his hand, having spent hours analyzing the novel's themes. Ms. Pennington's eyes passed over him. Anyone? She prompted. More hands went up. She called on Elizabeth Taylor, a girl whose father was on the school board. He's showing that the American dream is corrupted by materialism, Elizabeth answered. Good, Elizabeth, Ms. Pennington nodded. Anyone else? Caleb kept his hand raised, and after calling on 3 other students, Ms. Pennington finally acknowledged him with a slight frown. Yes, Caleb? I think Fitzgerald is also suggesting that the American dream is inherently exclusionary, Caleb said. Gatsby amasses wealth, but he's still considered an outsider by the old money elite. His background prevents him from truly belonging despite his achievements. Ms. Pennington blinked, seeming surprised by his articulate response. Yes, that's a valid interpretation, she conceded before quickly moving on to another question. When English ended, Caleb gathered his things and headed to the cafeteria for lunch. He found an empty table in the corner. Not difficult, as other students deliberately avoided sitting near him. He unwrapped the sandwich Naomi had prepared and pulled out a music theory book from his backpack. As he read about chord progressions and harmony, he was vaguely aware of the social dynamics playing out around him, the easy laughter, the shared jokes, the sense of belonging that everyone else seemed to take for granted. Occasionally, he caught fragments of conversations about weekend plans at country clubs or summer homes, worlds that existed only in his imagination. Caleb's afternoon schedule included his least favorite class, music with Mr. Reynolds. As he entered the classroom, the music teacher's eyes narrowed on him immediately. Mr. Williams, Reynolds called out, his voice carrying across the room. Tuck in that shirt properly, please. Caleb looked down at his uniform shirt, which was already tucked in. He adjusted it slightly while noticing that Tyler Adams across the aisle had his shirt completely untucked with no comment from the teacher. Mr. Reynolds was a tall man with thinning hair who carried himself with the posture of someone who believed in his own importance. His credentials, degrees from prestigious conservatories and brief stints with several orchestras, were frequently mentioned in class. He had made it clear from day one that he had high standards, though Caleb had noticed those standards seemed to vary depending on who was being evaluated. Today's lesson focused on the development of the symphony through the classical period. Reynolds spoke passionately about Mozart and Haydn, occasionally playing recordings to illustrate his points. Despite the teacher's attitude toward him, Caleb found himself drawn into the music, mentally analyzing the structures and techniques being discussed. When class ended, Caleb gathered his things and headed into the hallway. As he turned the corner, he nearly bumped into Mr. Whitmore, the school's elderly janitor. The old man steadied himself on his mop, nodding to Caleb with a faint smile. Something in that nod felt different from the interactions Caleb usually experienced at Westwood. There was recognition there, an acknowledgement that went beyond mere courtesy. Caleb nodded back before continuing down the hallway, unaware that this brief exchange would eventually take on greater significance. The final bell rang, and Caleb made his way outside to wait for his mother. Most students were being picked up in luxury SUVs or sports cars, or heading to after-school activities with private tutors and coaches. Caleb stood apart, watching as Naomi's aging sedan pulled up to the curb. "How was your day, honey?" she asked as he slid into the passenger seat. Caleb shrugged. "It was fine. We're analyzing The Great Gatsby in English and learning about classical symphonies and music." He didn't mention how Miss Pennington had ignored his raised hand or how Mr. Reynolds had singled him out for a uniform violation that didn't exist. What good would it do to worry his mother? She had enough on her plate. Through the car window, Caleb watched as Ethan Morgan, the principal's son, climbed into a brand new Tesla. Ethan was Westwood's star musician, particularly accomplished on the violin, which made Caleb's own interest in the instrument feel like yet another way he was trespassing on territory that wasn't meant for him. Back at the apartment, Caleb completed his homework before dinner, working methodically through math problems and history readings. After they ate, he helped clean up, then gathered his violin and headed to the bathroom. "Practice time?" Naomi asked with a smile. "Yeah, the tiles in there make the sound better," Caleb explained, though they both knew this routine well. The bathroom was small, but the acoustics were surprisingly good. Caleb closed the door, positioned himself between the shower and sink, and began to play. He started with scales and exercises before moving on to the pieces he was teaching himself. Without formal lessons, he relied on books, YouTube videos, and sheer determination to improve his technique. Outside the door, Naomi leaned against the wall, listening to her son play. Pride and worry battled on her face, pride in his undeniable talent. Worry about the obstacles that talent would face in a world that wasn't designed to recognize or nurture it. When the phone rang, she reluctantly moved away from the door. Caleb, lost in the music, didn't hear the phone or his mother's half of the conversation. He didn't see her face pale or her hands shake as she wrote down figures on a notepad. He didn't know that their landlord was calling about missed payments and the possibility of eviction. All he knew was the violin in his hands and the music flowing through him, the one place where he felt truly free. The following morning in music class, Mr. Reynolds stood at the front of the room with an unusual smile playing on his thin lips. There was something smug in his expression that immediately put Caleb on edge. "Attention, everyone," Reynolds announced, tapping his baton against the podium. "I have an exciting opportunity to share. Next Friday, we will be holding a surprise recital for the school board and several university representatives who will be visiting campus." A murmur of excitement rippled through the classroom. Caleb noticed several students exchanging confident glances. Ethan Morgan, sitting front and center as always, wore a particularly self-satisfied smirk. "This recital will showcase our music program's excellence," Reynolds continued, his gaze sweeping the room before landing deliberately on Caleb. "And to ensure we demonstrate our commitment to inclusion, everyone must participate. No exceptions." The way he emphasized inclusion made it clear this wasn't about equity, it was about something else entirely. Several students turned to look at Caleb, barely concealing their amusement. "Those who already study instruments will perform pieces appropriate to their level," Reynolds explained. "Those who don't." His eyes lingered on Caleb again. "Well, this will be an excellent opportunity to stretch beyond your comfort zone." After class, Caleb overheard Tyler Adams whispering to another student, "Reynolds is finally going to put the scholarship kid in his place. This is going to be epic." The rest of the day passed in a blur of anxiety. While other students discussed which pieces they would perform and arranged for extra sessions with their private instructors, Caleb calculated how much practice time he could squeeze from his already tight schedule. That afternoon, Caleb watched from the school steps as his classmates departed in luxury vehicles, many heading directly to private music lessons. Samantha Wilson's mother was discussing arrangements, with her daughter's violin tutor right there in the parking lot. Something about increasing sessions to twice weekly before the recital. Blake Thompson's father was on the phone, apparently pulling strings to get a renowned pianist to coach his son on short notice. Meanwhile, Caleb returned to his apartment and opened his laptop. a refurbished model that frequently froze during videos. He navigated to YouTube and searched for tutorials on the piece he'd been working on, a simplified version of Vivaldi's Winter from the Four Seasons. The video buffered every few seconds, making it difficult to follow, but Caleb persisted, taking notes and marking his sheet music when he couldn't actually play along. The next morning, Caleb arrived at school early, hoping to use one of the practice rooms before classes began. As he approached the music hall, he heard Ethan's voice around the corner. $50 says he can't even hold the bow correctly, Ethan was saying to a group of his friends. My dad says these scholarship cases are just for show anyway. They've never had one actually succeed here. I heard he lives in some project apartment, another voice added. Maybe he can play us some rap instead, a third voice suggested, followed by laughter. Caleb froze, his hand tightening around the strap of his backpack. He wanted to confront them, to tell them he'd been playing violin since he was 5, that his grandfather had been better than any of them would ever be despite never having the opportunities they took for granted. Instead, he turned and walked away, his face burning with a mixture of shame and anger. He didn't notice the girl watching this exchange from nearby, Olivia Franklin, a recent transfer student who frowned as she observed the scene. Later that day, as Caleb was putting books in his locker, someone tapped his shoulder. He turned to find a girl he didn't recognize standing there. She had warm brown skin and her hair was styled in neat box braids. Hi, she said. I'm Olivia. I just transferred here last week. Caleb nodded cautiously. I'm Caleb. I know, she replied. I've seen you in music class. She hesitated. I also saw what happened this morning with Ethan and his friends. Caleb's expression closed off immediately. It's fine. I'm used to it. You shouldn't have to be, Olivia said, her voice quiet, but firm. Anyway, I just wanted to introduce myself. Maybe I'll see you around. Before Caleb could respond, she had turned and walked away, leaving him slightly confused by the interaction. New students rarely approached him. They usually figured out the social hierarchy quickly enough to know he wasn't someone to associate with. That afternoon, passing by the teacher's lounge, Caleb slowed his pace when he heard Mr. Reynolds' voice mentioning the upcoming recital. It's really a perfect opportunity to demonstrate why certain standards exist, Reynolds was saying. The Williams boy might have some natural rhythm. They all do, don't they? But he completely lacks classical sensibility. It'll be educational for everyone to see the difference between actual training and whatever he's been doing. Another teacher laughed. Are you sure that's wise, Richard? The administration has been pushing this diversity initiative pretty hard. That's exactly why it's perfect, Reynolds replied. They want inclusion? Fine. We'll include him. But when he fails, it won't be because we excluded him. It'll be because he simply doesn't belong in this program. Caleb backed away from the door, his chest tight with humiliation and rage. The recital wasn't an opportunity. It was a setup. They wanted him to fail, to prove their point that students like him didn't belong at Westwood. That night, lying in bed unable to sleep, Caleb found himself thinking about his grandfather. William Williams had been a gifted violinist who never had the chance to study formally. Instead, he had played in jazz clubs and small venues, earning respect within their community, but never the wider recognition his talent deserved. Caleb closed his eyes and could almost see his grandfather's hands, strong and calloused, guiding his small fingers into position on the violin strings. Music speaks when words fail, Caleb, his grandfather had told him. When people won't listen to what you're saying, make them listen to how you play. The memory strengthened Caleb's resolve. He would practice harder, prepare better. He wouldn't give Reynolds the satisfaction of seeing him fail. The next day, Caleb arrived at the music department during lunch period to use a practice room. He had signed up for the time slot the previous day, but when he arrived, he found the room already occupied by Ethan and 2 other students. There must be a mistake, Caleb said, showing them the schedule. I reserved this room for 12:15. Ethan glanced at the paper, then back at Caleb with a shrug. Looks like there was a scheduling error. We've already set up, so. But I signed up yesterday, Caleb protested. I need to practice for the recital. Don't we all? One of Ethan's friends said with a smirk. Maybe try the janitor's closet? The acoustics might suit your style better. The boys laughed as they closed the door in Caleb's face. He stood there for a moment, weighing his options. Reporting them would likely backfire. Principal Morgan was Ethan's father, after all. Finding another practice room was impossible. They were all booked solid leading up to the recital. With no other choice, Caleb wandered the halls until he found an empty storage closet near the gymnasium. The space was cramped and smelled of cleaning supplies, but it was private. He carefully removed his violin from its case and began to play, trying to ignore the mops and buckets surrounding him. He was halfway through his piece when the door opened. Caleb froze, expecting a security guard or teacher to reprimand him. Instead, Mr. Whitmore, the elderly janitor, stood in the doorway. So that's where that beautiful sound was coming from, the old man said, his voice gentle. I thought I was hearing things. I'm sorry, Caleb said quickly, lowering his violin. I know I shouldn't be in here. The practice room I reserved there was a mix-up. Mr. Whitmore nodded, seeming to understand more than Caleb had said. No need to apologize. Music like that deserves to be played, no matter where. He paused, studying Caleb. You have a nice tone. Good vibrato, too. Caleb blinked in surprise. You know about violin? The janitor's eyes crinkled with amusement, but he didn't answer the question directly. You keep practicing wherever you can, young man. Some music is worth hearing, even if it comes from a closet. With that cryptic statement, he closed the door, leaving Caleb to wonder about the encounter. There had been something knowing in the old man's eyes, something that went beyond casual appreciation. The night before the recital, Caleb couldn't sleep. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at his grandfather's violin case. Inside was sheet music for his Vivaldi piece, dog-eared from constant review. He had practiced every spare moment, in the bathroom after dinner, during lunch in storage, closets even silently fingering passages under his desk during other classes. Naomi knocked softly on his door before entering. You should be sleeping, baby. Big day tomorrow. Yeah, Caleb said, not meeting her eyes. He hadn't told her the full truth about the recital, just that the music class was performing. He'd mentioned nothing about the mockery behind it, or what he'd overheard from the teachers. I asked for the morning off, Naomi said, sitting beside him. My shift doesn't start until 3, so I can come watch you play. Caleb's chest tightened. The thought of his mother witnessing his humiliation made everything worse. Mom, you don't have to. I want to, she interrupted, taking his hand. I wouldn't miss it for anything. Seeing her pride and excitement, Caleb couldn't bring himself to explain the reality of the situation. Instead, he nodded and forced a smile. Thanks, Mom. Naomi studied his face. You nervous? A little, he admitted. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a neatly folded handkerchief, one that had belonged to his grandfather. Your grandpa used to keep this in his pocket during performances, said it was his good luck charm. She pressed it into Caleb's palm. Thought you might want to have it with you tomorrow. Caleb's fingers closed around the soft fabric. Thanks, he whispered, his voice suddenly thick with emotion. The next morning dawned bright and clear. Caleb stood in front of his bedroom mirror, adjusting his uniform tie with trembling fingers. The handkerchief was carefully folded in his pocket. He briefly considered faking illness or simply not showing up, but that would only reinforce what Reynolds and the others believed about him. Naomi drove him to school, chatting enthusiastically about how proud his grandfather would be. Caleb nodded at appropriate intervals, his stomach clenching tighter with each mile. At school, the atmosphere was charged with excitement. Parents and board members filtered into the auditorium while students prepared backstage. Caleb found a quiet corner to unpack his violin, aware of the sidelong glances and whispers from his classmates. Mr. Reynolds was moving among the students, offering last-minute advice and encouragement to everyone except Caleb. When he passed by, he merely smirked and said, "Try not to embarrass yourself too badly, Williams." The recital began with piano performances, followed by woodwinds and brass. Each student played competently, receiving polite applause. Then came the string section, with Ethan performing first, a technically flawless rendering of a challenging Paganini piece that earned enthusiastic acclaim. Finally, it was Caleb's turn. As he walked onto the stage, time seemed to slow. He could hear whispers rippling through the audience, see Mr. Reynolds' satisfied smirk, feel the weight of dozens of eyes expecting, perhaps hoping, to witness his failure. With hands that refused to steady, Caleb removed his grandfather's old violin from its case. The instrument seemed suddenly foreign in his grip, as though all his hours of practice had evaporated in the heat of the spotlight. He positioned the violin under his chin, raised the bow, and began to play. The first note screeched horribly, causing scattered laughter to erupt from the audience. Caleb's face burned with shame as he saw Mr. Reynolds nod slightly, as if his point had been proven. In that moment of humiliation, Caleb's fingers found the handkerchief in his pocket. The familiar texture against his skin triggered a flood of memories. His grandfather's patient guidance, his mother's unwavering belief, the countless hours practiced in their tiny bathroom. Music isn't in the fingers, Caleb, his grandfather had once told him. It's in the heart. Your fingers just need to get out of the way. Taking a deep breath, Caleb closed his eyes. He repositioned the violin, adjusted his stance, and began again. This time, the note that emerged was pure and true, hanging in the air like a physical presence. It was followed by another, and another, each one flowing into the next with growing confidence. Something shifted in the auditorium. A subtle change in the quality of silence as scattered whispers gave way to attention. Caleb played with his eyes still closed, allowing the music to flow through him rather than trying to force it. His body swayed slightly with the rhythm of Vivaldi's Winter, his interpretation bringing warmth to the piece's depiction of cold. What he lacked in polished technique, he made up for with genuine emotion and surprising nuance. As the final movement began, Caleb opened his eyes and saw his mother slipping into the back of the auditorium. She had made it after all, her face glowing with pride as she watched her son perform. Their eyes met briefly across the distance, and Caleb's playing took on even greater intensity. In the audience, expressions were transforming from skepticism to surprise to genuine appreciation. Even some of the teachers who had expected disaster were leaning forward in their seats, brows furrowed in confusion at what they were hearing. Mr. Reynolds stood at the side of the stage, his smug smile long gone, replaced by a tight-lipped glare that grew more intense with each note Caleb played. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The joke was turning on him, and he knew it. When Caleb played the final note, there was a moment of complete silence. A pause so profound it seemed to suspend time itself. Then, beginning with a few students and quickly spreading, applause filled the auditorium. It wasn't the polite, measured applause that had followed other performances. This was spontaneous and genuine. Caleb stood on the stage, violin still in hand, momentarily stunned by the response. He found his mother in the crowd, tears streaming down her face as she clapped harder than anyone. For one perfect moment, he felt visible, truly seen for perhaps the first time since coming to Westwood. Then Mr. Reynolds stepped forward, cutting off the applause with a raised hand. "Well," he said loudly, "that was certainly unexpected." His tone carried an edge that silenced the room. "Though I do wonder about the arrangement you played, Mr. Williams. That seemed remarkably simplified compared to the original composition," Caleb started to respond, but Reynolds continued. "And this violin." He approached Caleb, hand extended. "May I examine it? The tone is unusual, almost as if it's been modified in some way." Confusion rippled through the audience. Reynolds was implying something improper, though few could understand what advantage a modified violin might offer. "There's nothing wrong with my violin," Caleb said, holding the instrument protectively. "Then you won't mind if I confirm that," Reynolds insisted, his hand still outstretched. "As your teacher, I need to ensure all performances are conducted according to standard protocols." Before Caleb could protest further, Principal Morgan had joined them on stage. "Is there a problem, Mr. Reynolds?" "Possibly," Reynolds replied. I'm concerned about the authenticity of this performance. Principal Morgan turned to Caleb with a stern expression. Mr. Williams, please come with us to my office. Bring the violin. As Caleb was led off stage, he caught a glimpse of his mother, standing up, her expression changing from pride to concern to anger. She started moving toward the stage, determined to follow them. The recital continued behind them as Principal Morgan led Caleb and Mr. Reynolds to his office, where the accusation of cheating would become a punishment that threatened everything Caleb had worked for, and where the true battle for his future would begin. The principal's office was silent, except for the ticking of an antique grandfather clock. Caleb sat rigidly in a leather chair, his grandfather's violin resting across his lap. His fingers trembled slightly as they traced the instrument's curves, not from fear, but from the lingering adrenaline of his performance. Across the massive oak desk, Principal Morgan leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin. Mr. Reynolds stood by the window, arms crossed, a vein visibly pulsing at his temple. Mr. Williams, Principal Morgan began, his voice carrying the practiced calm of someone accustomed to authority. Mr. Reynolds has raised some concerns about your performance today. Caleb's mouth felt dry. I don't understand, sir. What concerns? Reynolds stepped forward. That piece. The way you played it. It wasn't what we expected from someone with your background. My background? Caleb repeated, the implication clear. Your musical background, Reynolds clarified, though his tone suggested otherwise. You've never formally studied violin, yet suddenly you're playing Vivaldi with an unexpected level of proficiency. It raises questions. Before Caleb could respond, the office door burst open. Naomi Williams stood in the doorway, her work uniform partially hidden beneath her coat, eyes blazing with protective fury. What exactly is happening here? She demanded, moving immediately to Caleb's side. Why was my son pulled from the stage after his performance? Principal Morgan frowned at the interruption. Mrs. Williams, we're simply conducting a standard review. There was nothing standard about how you removed my son from that stage, Naomi interrupted. He played beautifully, and instead of acknowledging that, you're treating him like he's done something wrong. Reynolds stepped forward. Mrs. Williams, we have protocols for these performances. Your son's playing was irregular. We need to examine his instrument and determine if there were any improper advantages. Improper advantages? Naomi's voice rose. The only advantage my son has is talent and hard work. What exactly are you implying? We're not implying anything, Principal Morgan said smoothly. We simply need to verify. You need to verify that a black boy can play violin that well? Naomi challenged, her words cutting through the diplomatic facade. Is that what this is about? An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Caleb watched the adults, his heart pounding. He'd never heard his mother speak so directly about the discrimination they both knew existed at Westwood. Principal Morgan cleared his throat. Mrs. Williams, this has nothing to do with race. It's about maintaining the integrity of our music program. Then explain to me why my son is the only student being questioned, Naomi demanded. Before Morgan could respond, there was another knock at the door. Ms. Harris, the vice principal, entered with a concerned expression. Excuse me, but the recital is continuing and there are several parents asking what happened with the Williams boy, she said. It's causing quite a stir. Principal Morgan glanced at Reynolds, clearly weighing his options. This discussion can be continued at another time, he finally said. Mr. Williams, you may return to the auditorium, but I will be holding on to this violin for proper examination. No, Caleb said quietly but firmly, surprising even himself. This was my grandfather's violin. It goes where I go. Morgan's eyebrows rose at the defiance. Mr. Williams, if you want to continue at Westwood, if you take my son's violin without cause, our next conversation will be with a lawyer, Naomi interrupted, placing a protective hand on Caleb's shoulder. The principal and Mr. Reynolds exchanged glances. Neither had expected this level of resistance. Fine, Morgan conceded reluctantly. Keep the violin for now. But you are suspended from music activities until we resolve this matter. Mr. Reynolds will provide alternative assignments. As Caleb and Naomi left the office, the sound of applause drifted from the distant auditorium, a reminder of what should have been a moment of triumph, now tainted by suspicion and prejudice. "You were amazing, baby," Naomi whispered as they walked down the hallway. "Don't let them take that away from you." Caleb nodded, but the tightness in his chest remained. The victory he'd briefly tasted had been snatched away, replaced by a familiar sense of being seen as an outsider, someone whose success was suspicious rather than celebrated. The following Monday, Caleb returned to school with a heaviness in his steps. News of his performance and its aftermath had spread throughout Westwood. As he walked through the hallways, he noticed a subtle shift in how other students regarded him. Some still avoided his gaze, but others watched him with newfound curiosity. A few even nodded in greeting, acknowledging him for perhaps the first time. In English class, Ms. Pennington called on him twice, something that had never happened before. At lunch, he found his usual isolated table occupied by a group of juniors, forcing him to sit elsewhere. When he located another empty spot, a girl named Sarah Thompson, who had never spoken to him before, asked if he minded if she sat at his table. "Go ahead," he said, surprised. "Your violin playing was really good," she said as she arranged her lunch. "My brother plays cello and he said your tone was amazing." Before Caleb could thank her, several of Sarah's friends approached, hesitating when they saw who she was sitting with. "Are you guys coming?" one of them asked, glancing uncertainly at Caleb. Sarah looked torn, caught between her momentary courage and the pull of established social hierarchies. "I'll be there in a minute," she finally said, gathering her barely touched lunch and offering Caleb an apologetic smile before leaving. It wasn't much, but it was a change. A small crack in the invisible wall that had surrounded him since his arrival at Westwood. Not everyone's attitude had improved, however. As Caleb rounded a corner on his way to history class, he found Ethan Morgan and several of his friends blocking the hallway. "Well, if it isn't Westwood's newest celebrity," Ethan said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Pretty clever how you managed to fool everyone." Caleb tried to move past them, but one of Ethan's friends stepped into his path. "My father thinks it's interesting how someone with no formal training suddenly plays like that," Ethan continued. "He's looking into your background pretty thoroughly now." "There's nothing to look into," Caleb replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "I practiced. I played. That's it." Ethan laughed. "Right. And I'm sure that old violin is just a regular instrument. No modifications, no tricks." "The only trick," came a voice from behind them, "is how some people can't recognize talent when they hear it." Olivia Franklin stood a few feet away, arms crossed, expression resolute. Several other students had stopped to watch the confrontation, creating an unexpected audience. Ethan's smile faltered slightly. "This isn't your business, new girl." "Bullying never is anyone's business, is it?" Olivia replied. "That's how it continues." She stepped forward, positioning herself beside Caleb. "Some of us actually thought your playing was brilliant," she said to him, loud enough for others to hear. It had something Ethan's performance didn't. Soul. Murmurs rippled through the gathering crowd. Ethan's face flushed with anger, but with witnesses present, his options were limited. "Whatever," he muttered, backing down but pointing at Caleb. "This isn't over." He shouldered past them, his friends following in his wake. When they were gone, Caleb turned to Olivia. "Thanks. You didn't have to do that." "Actually, I did," she replied. "My last school had bullies too. I promised myself I wouldn't be a silent bystander again." She tilted her head, studying him. "Your playing really was amazing, you know. I played piano for years in New York. I recognize real talent when I hear it." Before Caleb could respond, the bell rang, signaling they were both late for class. "We should talk sometime," Olivia said, already backing away. "About music, I mean." Caleb nodded, a small smile forming despite the day's tensions. "Yeah, I'd like that." The afternoon brought another unexpected encounter. As Caleb sat on the school steps after final bell, Waiting for his mother, Mr. Whitmore emerged from a side door, pushing his cleaning cart. The elderly janitor paused when he saw Caleb, then deliberately steered his cart in that direction. "Afternoon, young man," he said, positioning himself beside the steps. "Heard you caused quite a stir at the recital." Caleb shrugged. "Not intentionally," Mr. Whitmore chuckled, the sound warm and genuine. "The best kinds of stirs are never intentional." He began methodically checking his supplies, though his attention remained on Caleb. "You know, I heard you playing that day in the storage closet. Knew right then what they didn't want to see." "What's that?" Caleb asked. The old man looked up, his eyes reflecting decades of experience. "That music doesn't care about your zip code or your skin color. Music only cares about what's in here." He tapped his chest. "And what's in here?" He raised his right hand, turning it to reveal calloused fingertips, the unmistakable mark of a string player. Caleb stared at those calluses, suddenly understanding there was more to this janitor than his worn uniform suggested. "You play?" he asked, voice hushed with surprise. Mr. Whitmore smiled, a mixture of pride and old pain crossing his features. "Used to. Many years ago now." He glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard. "If you're serious about that instrument of yours, meet me by the maintenance room tomorrow after school, 7 o'clock. Most everyone's gone by then." Before Caleb could ask more questions, Naomi's car pulled up to the curb. Mr. Whitmore nodded once, then continued on his way, pushing his cart as though their conversation had been about nothing more significant than the weather. That evening, as Caleb helped with dinner dishes, he debated whether to tell his mother about Mr. Whitmore's invitation. Naomi was already worried enough about his situation at school. Adding a mysterious meeting with the janitor might only increase her concern. "You're quiet tonight," Naomi observed, handing him a plate to dry. "Rough day?" "Not really," Caleb said. "Just thinking about some stuff." Naomi studied his face. "Ethan giving you trouble?" "Some," Caleb admitted. "But it's fine. I handled it." "You shouldn't have to handle anything," Naomi sighed. "That school has responsibilities to all its students, not just the wealthy ones." Caleb nodded, then decided to share at least part of what was on his mind. "Mom, did you know Mr. Whitmore plays violin?" "The janitor?" Naomi asked, surprised. "No, I had no idea. He showed me his fingers today. They have calluses like mine." Caleb hesitated. "I think he was really good once." Naomi considered this. "Well, there are many talented people who end up in jobs that don't showcase their gifts, especially people who look like us from your grandfather's generation." Caleb thought about the invitation to meet at the maintenance room. "He seems nice, different from the other adults at school." "Just be careful, baby," Naomi said, her protective instincts evident. "This situation with the recital has already caused enough trouble. I don't want you getting into anything that could make things worse." Caleb nodded, but in his mind he'd already decided to meet Mr. Whitmore the next day. His instincts told him the janitor might be the only person at Westwood who truly understood what he was facing. Unknown to Caleb, another conversation about him was taking place across town, in the Morgan family's expansive home. "I still don't understand why we're making such a big deal about this scholarship kid," Ethan complained, stabbing at his dinner. "So he can play one piece. Big deal." "Principal," Morgan sipped his wine thoughtfully. "It's not about the playing itself, son. It's about the implications. Reynolds was very specific about this boy's lack of formal training. If he truly played that well without proper instruction, it could draw attention." "What kind of attention?" Ethan asked. "The kind that brings university scouts looking for raw talent rather than pedigree," his father replied. "The kind that might make people question the advantages of expensive private instruction versus natural ability." Ethan put down his fork, suddenly understanding. "You mean the kind of attention that might affect my scholarship chances?" Principal Morgan didn't respond directly, but his expression confirmed Ethan's conclusion. For years, they'd been building Ethan's musical resume, investing in the best teachers, the best opportunities, all aimed at securing a place at a prestigious conservatory, the same path the principal himself had once followed. "Don't worry about Williams," Morgan said finally. "Reynolds and I will handle it. You focus on your upcoming performances." Ethan nodded, but a seed of resentment had already taken root. The scholarship kid was becoming a threat, one that needed to be eliminated. The next evening, after most students and faculty had left, Caleb made his way to the maintenance room in the school's east wing. The hallways were eerily quiet, illuminated only by security lights that cast long shadows across the polished floors. He found the door Mr. Whitmore had mentioned and knocked softly. After a moment, it opened to reveal the janitor in his street clothes rather than his usual uniform, a simple button-down shirt and slacks that somehow transformed him from staff to someone with quiet dignity. "You came," Mr. Whitmore said, genuine pleasure in his voice. "Come in, quickly now." The maintenance room was larger than Caleb had expected, a combination of storage space and workshop. In one corner, a small area had been cleared with 2 chairs set facing each other, and a single lamp providing warm light. And there, resting on one of the chairs, was a violin case. Not new or expensive, but well-maintained, similar in age to the one Caleb's grandfather had left him. "Sir," Caleb began. "Are you really a violinist?" Mr. Whitmore smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening. "Was, and please call me Daniel when we're alone. Sir and Mr. Whitmore are for the hallways." He gestured for Caleb to sit, then carefully opened the violin case, revealing an instrument that, while not visibly valuable, had clearly been cherished. "This is a Ludwig Glazel, made in the 1940s. Not fancy by Westwood standards, but she's faithful." He lifted the violin with practiced hands, positioned it under his chin, and played a brief passage that filled the room with rich, confident notes, clearly the work of someone with formal training. Caleb stared, captivated by the transformation. The man before him was no longer the unassuming janitor who faded into the background of school life. This was an artist, temporarily reclaiming his true identity. When the last note faded, Mr. Whitmore, Daniel, lowered the violin. "Been a while since I played for anyone. Fingers aren't what they used to be." "That was beautiful," Caleb said honestly. "Where did you learn to play like that?" A shadow passed over Daniel's face. "Juilliard, if you can believe it. Class of '72. One of the first black students they accepted." He ran his fingers along the violin's neck. "Played with the Atlanta Symphony for 3 years after graduation, then Chicago for a season." "What happened?" Caleb asked, sensing the story's unhappy turn. Daniel set the violin carefully in its case. "Life happened. Racism happened. Politics within the orchestra happened." He shrugged, the gesture containing decades of resignation. Black classical musicians weren't exactly welcomed with open arms in those days. Still aren't, in many places. "So, how did you end up?" Caleb hesitated, not wanting to sound disrespectful. "As a janitor at Westwood?" Daniel finished for him, no offense in his tone. "That's a long story for another day, but I will tell you I once taught here. Briefly. Music, theory and strings back in the early '80s. Caleb's eyes widened. "You were a teacher here?" "For exactly 1 semester," Daniel confirmed, "until I suggested that talented black students from the local community should be actively recruited for the orchestra." His smile was tinged with irony. "The administration disagreed with my vision." "And you stayed? As a janitor?" Caleb couldn't hide his confusion. "Sometimes, young man, you stay because leaving means nobody's watching." Daniel leaned forward. "Now let's talk about your playing. You're entirely self-taught except for basics from your grandfather, correct?" Caleb nodded. "He showed me how to hold the violin and bow and some simple pieces. After he died, I used books and YouTube videos." Daniel shook his head, impressed. That violin recital, that was raw talent and instinct. But talent without proper technique will only take you so far. He held out his hand. "May I see your grandfather's violin?" Caleb hesitated only briefly before opening his case. Daniel examined the instrument respectfully, checking its setup and condition. "This is a good instrument with a lovely tone, but it needs a proper setup, he said. The bridge position is affecting your intonation, and these strings have seen better days. He handed it back to Caleb. Now show me how you hold your bow. For the next hour, Daniel made small but crucial corrections to Caleb's technique. The angle of his wrist, the pressure of his fingers on the strings, the distribution of weight in his bow arm. Each adjustment was minor, but Caleb could immediately hear the difference in the sound he produced. You have a natural ear and emotional depth that can't be taught, Daniel explained. But technique, that's the framework that allows your musicality to fully express itself. As their impromptu lesson concluded, Caleb felt both exhilarated and overwhelmed. Everything he thought he knew about playing violin was being reconstructed into something more solid, more intentional. Same time next week? Daniel asked as Caleb packed up his violin. Yes, please, Caleb responded without hesitation. Daniel nodded, satisfied. Practice what I showed you. Not just the exercises, the mindset. Every note has intention. Every phrase tells a story. As Caleb prepared to leave, Daniel added, And Caleb, what happens in this room stays between us, for both our sakes. Caleb understood. Daniel was risking his position by teaching him, just as Caleb was risking further scrutiny by seeking instruction outside approved channels. He nodded his agreement, then slipped out into the darkened hallway, his head spinning with new knowledge and possibilities. The next morning, Caleb entered Westwood with a different energy. The secret lesson with Daniel had shifted something fundamental in his understanding of music and of himself. For the first time, he felt a genuine connection to the school, even if that connection existed in a maintenance room after hours. As he navigated the hallway to his locker, he noticed the subtle changes in how other students reacted to him. Some still avoided eye contact, but others nodded or offered tentative smiles. His performance at the recital had disrupted the established order, forcing a recalibration of where he fit in the school's social hierarchy. Nice job at the recital. Man, said Thomas Baker, a cellist from the orchestra as they passed in the hall. That was unexpected. Before Caleb could respond, Ethan Morgan appeared with several of his friends, deliberately bumping Thomas's shoulder. Careful, Baker, Ethan warned. Associating with cheaters isn't good for your reputation. Thomas looked between Ethan and Caleb, then muttered an apology to no one in particular before hurrying away. Still enjoying your 15 minutes of fame? Ethan asked Caleb, his voice low and threatening. Better savor it. My father and Reynolds are building a case. Won't be long before everyone knows how you pulled off that little stunt. There was no stunt, Caleb said evenly, refusing to be intimidated. I played. People listened. That's all. Right, Ethan scoffed. The scholarship charity case suddenly plays like a prodigy. Totally believable. Maybe you're just not as special. As Daddy's been telling you, came Olivia's voice as she approached, books clutched to her chest. Ethan's eyes narrowed. You really want to pick sides already, new girl? Not smart. I'm not picking sides, Olivia replied calmly. I'm stating facts. As someone who studied at the Manhattan School of Music's prep division, I know talent when I hear it. This new information about Olivia's background momentarily stunned both boys. Ethan recovered first, scowling before stalking away with his friends in tow. Manhattan School of Music? Caleb asked when they were alone. You didn't mention that before. Olivia shrugged. It didn't come up. I played piano there for 4 years before my dad's job moved us here. She glanced in the direction Ethan had gone. Guys like him are the same everywhere. Talented enough to be good, but not talented enough to be great. And they know it, deep down. Caleb smiled, appreciating her directness. Thanks for the backup. Again. What are friends for? Olivia replied, then looked slightly embarrassed. I mean, if you want to be friends. I'd like that, Caleb said, realizing how long it had been since he'd had a genuine friend at school. They walked together to their first class, unaware that they were being observed by Principal Morgan from his office window. The principal's expression darkened as he watched the new alliance forming. The Franklin girl came from a connected family. Her father was some kind of attorney in New York. Having her align with Williams complicated matters. Later that day, As Caleb left his final class, he was surprised to find his mother waiting. In the main foyer, her expression a mixture of frustration and barely contained anger. "Mom? What's wrong?" he asked, approaching quickly. "I've been here for 3 hours," Naomi said, keeping her voice low but intense. 3 hours waiting to speak with Principal Morgan about your violin that they're still holding." Caleb glanced toward the administrative offices. "They wouldn't see you?" "Oh, they saw me," Naomi replied bitterly. "Made me wait in that reception area while Morgan was in meetings. Then his assistant offered me paperwork to formally request the return of an instrument that belongs to us in the first place." Before Caleb could respond, the main doors opened, and a well-dressed couple entered with Olivia between them. Olivia spotted Caleb and waved, steering her parents in their direction. "Mom, this is Olivia," Caleb said as they approached. "She's new here too. Dr. and Mr. Franklin," Naomi greeted them with a polite smile, automatically shifting into her professional demeanor despite her frustration. "Please, I'm James, and this is my wife, Rebecca," Olivia's father said, extending his hand. "Olivia has mentioned your son. She was quite impressed by his performance at the recital." "Thank you," Naomi said. "Caleb works very hard at his music." Rebecca Franklin noticed the tension in Naomi's posture. "Is everything all right? You seem troubled." Naomi hesitated, then decided honesty was better than pretense. The school confiscated Caleb's violin after his performance, claiming they needed to examine it. "I've been waiting hours trying to get it back." James Franklin's expression shifted, subtly, a professional alertness entering his eyes. "They took your son's personal property without due process or evidence of wrongdoing." "Yes," Naomi confirmed. "It was his grandfather's violin." James exchanged a look with his wife. "I'm an attorney," he explained to Naomi. "Civil rights law specifically. That sounds problematic at best." "Dad," Olivia interjected, "Caleb is really good. The teachers were surprised because he doesn't take private lessons like everyone else." Rebecca raised an eyebrow. "And instead of recognizing talent, they assumed—" "Exactly," Naomi said, the word carrying all her frustration. James handed Naomi his business card. "I'd be interested in hearing more about this situation. Perhaps we could continue this conversation another time?" Naomi accepted the card, a small spark of hope kindling. "I'd appreciate that very much." As the Franklins continued to the administration offices, Olivia hung back briefly. "My dad doesn't like bullies," she told Caleb with a small smile. "Especially institutional ones." Later that evening, Caleb sat at his desk, attempting to concentrate on homework, but repeatedly finding his thoughts returning to Daniel's lessons and the unexpected support from the Franklins. For the first time since coming to Westwood, he felt less alone, as though allies were emerging from unexpected corners. His phone buzzed with a text from Olivia. "My dad's asking questions about Westwood's history with minority students. Says, the answers are interesting." Caleb was about to respond when another notification appeared, an email from an unfamiliar address. The subject line read, "Your performance." Curious, he opened it to find a message from someone named Ms. Holloway. "Dear Caleb, I was in the audience at Westwood's recital and was struck by your interpretation of Vivaldi. Your playing has a rare emotional quality that cannot be taught. I would be interested in discussing your musical future if you're amenable. Please call me at your convenience. Sincerely, Eleanor Holloway, Director, Metropolitan Youth Orchestra." Caleb stared at the screen, reading the email 3 times to ensure he hadn't misunderstood. The Metropolitan Youth Orchestra was prestigious, a training ground for serious musicians with aspirations toward professional careers. How had the director even heard about him? Across town, in the expansive study of the Morgan home, another conversation about Caleb was taking place. This one far less supportive. "The Franklin girl's father was asking questions today, Principal," Morgan informed his son. "Pointed questions about our disciplinary statistics and scholarship program outcomes." Ethan looked up from his homework. "What does that have to do with Williams?" "James Franklin is a civil rights attorney," Morgan explained tersely. The kind who makes headlines and ends careers. If he's showing interest in our handling of the Williams situation, it could become problematic. So what are you going to, do? Ethan asked. Morgan closed the file he'd been reviewing. Reynolds and I are exploring options. In the meantime, I need you to distance yourself from this situation. No more public confrontations with Williams. But he's a cheater, Ethan protested. Everyone knows what everyone knows doesn't matter, Morgan interrupted sharply. What can be proven matters, and right now the optics aren't in our favor. Ethan sank back in his chair, frustration evident in his posture. He'd spent years being the unchallenged star of Westwood's music program. Now, because of some scholarship kid's fluke performance, his father was telling him to back down? Fine, he muttered, already formulating a plan of his own. If his father and Reynolds couldn't handle Williams properly, perhaps it was time for a more direct approach. The disciplinary hearing was scheduled for Thursday morning. Caleb sat beside his mother in a small conference room, facing a panel that included Principal Morgan, Mr. Reynolds, the vice principal, and 2 board members. The wood-paneled room with its imposing furniture seemed designed to intimidate. This hearing addresses the vandalism incident in the music room last Friday, Principal Morgan began, his voice carrying practiced authority. Alleged vandalism, James Franklin corrected. The attorney sat beside Naomi, having agreed to represent them pro bono after hearing about Caleb's situation from his daughter. Principal Morgan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. We're discussing destruction of school property valued at over $3,000. Photos were distributed showing the music room in disarray, sheet music torn and scattered across the floor, instrument cases opened with contents dumped out, and a violin with its strings snapped. Mr. Williams was the last person seen near. The music room before the damage was discovered, Reynolds stated, his gaze fixed somewhere above Caleb's head. By whom? Franklin asked. By me, Reynolds replied. I was working late and saw him in the hallway around 5:30 p.m. That's impossible, Caleb said, leaning forward. I was with my mother at the grocery store then. Naomi nodded, pulling a receipt from her purse. We have a receipt from Wilson's Market, time-stamped 5:47 p.m. We were there together from 5:15 until almost 6:30. She placed the receipt on the table, but Principal Morgan barely glanced at it. Receipt or not, security footage would have shown anyone else entering that area, he countered. Then let's see the footage, Franklin suggested reasonably. Vice Principal Harris shifted in her seat. Unfortunately, there was a technical malfunction. With that particular camera, the system shows no footage from Friday afternoon. How convenient, Naomi muttered. Principal Morgan ignored her comment. The evidence points to Mr. Williams. No one else had motive to damage those particular instruments. What motive would my son possibly have? Naomi demanded. Reynolds leaned forward. Perhaps frustration over being suspended from music activities after his controversial performance. Controversial only because you made it so, Franklin pointed out. The hearing continued for nearly an hour, with each piece of circumstantial evidence presented and immediately refuted. Throughout it all, Caleb remained mostly silent, watching, as adults argued over his fate based on assumptions rather than facts. Finally, Principal Morgan leaned back and steepled his fingers. Given the circumstances, we're prepared to offer an alternative to formal expulsion. Caleb tensed. Expulsion hadn't been mentioned until now. We are willing to accept voluntary withdrawal from Westwood Academy, Morgan continued smoothly. This would leave Mr. Williams's record unmarked, allowing him to transfer without prejudice. And the alternative? Franklin asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. A permanent disciplinary mark for destruction of property, which would remain on his record for all future educational institutions to review, including potential music programs or scholarship committees. The threat was unmistakable. Leave quietly or be branded. You're asking my son to admit to something he didn't do, Naomi said, her voice trembling with barely controlled anger. We're offering a clean exit, Morgan replied. Given the evidence. What evidence? Franklin interrupted. You have no witnesses, No footage, and Mr. Williams has an alibi. This isn't disciplinary action. It's coercion. Principal Morgan's professionally pleasant expression hardened. We'll need your decision within 48 hours. Until then, Mr. Williams is suspended from classes. As they left the conference room, Caleb felt numb. The injustice was so blatant, yet so difficult to fight. Outside in the parking lot, Franklin placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. This isn't over, the lawyer promised. They're hoping you'll take the easy way out, but we have options. Naomi nodded gratefully, but Caleb could see the worry lines deepening around her eyes. The drive home was silent, each lost in their own thoughts. When they arrived at their apartment building, Mrs. Patterson, their elderly neighbor, was waiting by the entrance. "Naomi, honey," she said as they approached, "the landlord was here. Left something on your door." Caleb and Naomi exchanged a glance before hurrying upstairs. Taped to their apartment door was an official eviction notice, citing 3 months of partial payments as grounds for termination of their lease. They had 2 weeks to vacate. Inside, Naomi carefully placed her purse on the kitchen table, her movements deliberate and controlled. "Mom, it's going to be okay," Caleb offered, knowing how inadequate the words were. "Is it?" she asked, finally turning to face him. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "They're trying to push you out of that school. We're about to lose our home, and I'm working double shifts just to keep us afloat." The dam broke. Tears streamed down her face as months of held-back fears and frustrations poured out. Caleb moved to embrace her, and for a brief moment their roles reversed. He became the protector, the comfort giver. "We'll figure it out," he promised, though he had no idea how. That night, after his mother had fallen into exhausted sleep, Caleb sat at his desk searching online for public schools with decent music programs. Most had suffered funding cuts, their arts programs reduced to bare minimums. None offered the opportunities Westwood did, despite its toxic culture. The next day, after another secret session with Daniel in the maintenance room, Caleb learned more about the janitor's history with Westwood. "It wasn't just about recruiting black students," Daniel explained, adjusting Caleb's bow hold. "I wanted to introduce jazz and African-American classical composers into the curriculum, expand beyond dead European men." "And that got you fired?" Caleb asked. Daniel smiled ruefully. "That, and catching Principal Morgan's father, who was the music director back then, using racial slurs to describe a guest musician. So why stay? Why work as a janitor in a place that treated you like that?" Daniel set his violin down. "Because someone needs to bear witness. Someone needs to be here to see the patterns, to remember." He leaned forward. "Do you know how many talented minority students have been pushed out of Westwood over the years? Dozens. All through the same playbook. Accusations of rule-breaking, character assassination, pressure to voluntarily withdraw." Caleb absorbed this, seeing his own situation as part of a larger pattern. Mr. Franklin, Olivia's dad, is looking into the school's history. "Good," Daniel nodded. "It's long overdue for someone to shine a light on what happens here." As Caleb prepared to leave, Daniel placed a hand on his shoulder. "Whatever you decide about Westwood, don't let them take music from you. That's yours, no matter what school you attend." When Caleb arrived home, he was surprised to find Naomi in conversation with a stranger, an elegant black woman in her 50s, with close-cropped silver hair and an air of quiet authority. "Caleb," Naomi said, an unusual brightness in her voice. "This is Ms. Holloway." The woman stood, extending her hand. "Eleanor Holloway. I've been looking forward to meeting you." The name registered immediately. "The email. You're from the Metropolitan Youth Orchestra," she nodded. "I am, though my connection to you is a bit more circuitous than my message suggested." She gestured toward the couch. "May we sit?" Once they were settled, Ms. Holloway explained her presence. "I received 2 calls about your performance at Westwood. The first was from James Franklin, whom I've known professionally for years. The second, more surprisingly, was from Daniel Whitmore. Caleb blinked in surprise. You know Mr. Whitmore? Ms. Holloway smiled warmly. Daniel was my first violin teacher many years ago before he went to Juilliard. We've stayed in touch, though discreetly, given his complicated relationship with Westwood. She opened her bag and removed a tablet, tapping the screen to pull up a video. Someone recorded your performance. Daniel sent me this. She turned the tablet so they could see the screen, which showed Caleb on stage at the recital, playing his grandfather's violin. The video quality wasn't professional, but it clearly captured his performance and the audience's stunned reaction. You have something rare, Caleb, Ms. Holloway said. Technical skills can be taught, but the emotional intelligence in your playing, that's innate. That's what separates competent musicians from compelling artists. She set the tablet aside. I'd like to offer you a place in the Young Artist competition next month. It normally requires extensive auditions, but in your case, I'm making an exception. Caleb and Naomi exchanged stunned glances. The competition includes a cash prize, Ms. Holloway continued, and more importantly, exposure to conservatory recruiters. It could open doors regardless of what happens with Westwood. But I don't even have my violin, Caleb said. The school still has it. I've brought a loaner, Ms. Holloway replied, nodding toward a case propped by the door. It's a teacher's instrument from our program, not exceptional but reliable, and I've spoken with a luthier who's willing to help restore your grandfather's violin once it's returned. The unexpected support, first from Daniel, then the Franklins, and now Ms. Holloway, felt overwhelming after months of isolation at Westwood. Why? Caleb couldn't help asking. Why go to all this trouble for someone you just met? Ms. Holloway's expression grew serious. Because talent like yours deserves nurturing, not obstruction. And because I've watched too many promising musicians of color get sidelined by systems designed to exclude them. She held his gaze. Your playing honors your grandfather's legacy. I'd like to help you build your own. The following day, James Franklin called to inform them that the school board had convened an emergency meeting about Caleb's case and was offering a settlement, a significant sum in exchange for signing a non-disclosure agreement about the discrimination he'd faced. How significant? Naomi asked, her mind immediately calculating rent, bills, and the security deposit they'd need for a new apartment. Enough to solve your housing situation and then some, Franklin replied. But it comes with complete silence about everything that's happened. That evening, Caleb found Naomi at the kitchen table surrounded by bills and calculations. The settlement would fix everything, she said without looking up. We could find a new place, maybe closer to one of the better public schools. Caleb sat across from her. But they'd get away with it, again, like they did with all those other students Mr. Whitmore told me about. Naomi finally met his eyes. I know, and that makes me furious. She reached across the table to take his hand. But I'm your mother before I'm an activist. My first responsibility is to keep you safe and housed. I'd rather be homeless than watch you sign away the truth, Caleb said quietly but firmly. Naomi stared at her son, seeing not just the boy she'd raised, but the man he was becoming, principled and unwilling to compromise his integrity, even when it would be easier to do. So, the next morning, they met with the school board representatives in a conference room at Franklin's office. The settlement offer was laid out formally, a check in exchange for signatures on several legal documents, including the NDA. Naomi listened to the board chairman's rehearsed speech about moving forward amicably and putting unfortunate misunderstandings behind us. She accepted the papers when they were slid across the table, reading each one carefully while the board members exchanged self-satisfied glances. Then, with deliberate calm, she tore the documents in half. My son isn't for sale, she said, rising from her chair. And neither is our dignity. The board chairman sputtered in shock. Mrs. Williams, please reconsider. This offer is more than generous. It's hush money, Naomi interrupted. And we're not interested. As they left the meeting, Caleb felt a mixture of pride and fear. They had taken a stand on principle, but their practical problems remained unsolved. What now? He asked as they reached the street. Naomi squared her shoulders. Now you start practicing for that competition, and I start looking for a second job. Meanwhile, in Ms. Holloway's studio across town, Caleb began intensive training for the Young Artists competition. 3 evenings a week, after his secret sessions, with Daniel, he worked with Ms. Holloway on the technical aspects of competition performance. Under her guidance and with Daniel's continued mentorship, Caleb's playing evolved rapidly. The fundamentals his grandfather had taught him, combined with his self-taught determination and now professional instruction, created a unique approach that began to define his personal style. As the competition drew closer, Caleb faced a difficult decision: what piece to perform. Most competitors would play established classical works, technically demanding pieces designed to showcase virtuosity. "I want to compose something," he told Ms. Holloway during one of their sessions. "Something that combines classical structure with elements of my grandfather's jazz influences." Ms. Holloway considered this. Original composition is permitted, but it's risky. Judges tend to favor traditional repertoire they can easily compare across performers. "But it would be authentic to me," Caleb argued, "to my story." After some discussion, they agreed he would compose his own piece, a bold choice that might distinguish him from other competitors or alienate more conservative judges. In the weeks that followed, as Caleb devoted himself to preparation, tensions at Westwood escalated. Despite his suspension, rumors of his upcoming competition appearance had spread. Ethan, discovering that Caleb would be competing in the same prestigious event he'd been preparing for, felt his position as Westwood's premier musician threatened. One afternoon, as Caleb was leaving Ms. Holloway's studio, Ethan was waiting outside, leaning against his car with calculated casualness. "Heard you're entering the Young Artists competition," he said. "Pretty ambitious for someone without formal training." Caleb adjusted his grip on his violin case. "Is there something you want, Ethan?" "Just a friendly warning," Ethan replied, his smile not reaching his eyes. "That competition is serious business. Judges have expectations, connections. They know which teachers and schools produce real talent." "Thanks for your concern," Caleb said dryly, moving to walk past. Ethan stepped into his path. "My father's known 3 of the judges for years. They've watched me perform since I was 10. His voice lowered. "So even if you get lucky again, it won't matter. Some doors don't open for people like you, no matter how well you play." The threat was thinly veiled, but Caleb refused to show any reaction. "I guess we'll find out soon enough." As he walked away, Caleb couldn't help wondering if Ethan's confidence was justified. Were the competition judges already biased in favor of students from prestigious schools with connections to the classical music establishment? But that night, as he worked on his composition, a piece he'd titled "Grandfather's Hands," he remembered Daniel's words. "Don't let them take music from you, that's yours." Win or lose, his music would be heard, his truth would be played. The Westlake Concert Hall gleamed in the morning sunlight, its modernist glass facade reflecting the clear blue sky. Luxury cars and SUVs dropped off young musicians and their families, volunteers directing them to registration tables and warm-up rooms. Caleb and Naomi arrived via public bus, stopping a block away. Caleb carried Ms. Holloway's loaned violin case, while Naomi held a garment bag containing the suit they'd purchased from a thrift store and carefully tailored for the occasion. "Ready?" Naomi asked as they paused at the edge of the plaza. Caleb nodded, taking in the scene, the confident competitors, the anxious parents, the atmosphere of privilege that felt so familiar from Westwood. But this time, he wasn't entering as an outsider looking to belong. He was coming as himself, on his own terms. Ms. Holloway met them at the entrance, providing official competitor badges. "The performance order was determined by random draw," she explained. "You'll be performing 14th out of 22 contestants, which is a good position. Not too early to be forgotten, not too late when judges are fatigued." She guided them to a small practice room where Caleb could warm up and change. "I'll come get you 30 minutes before your time slot. Try to stay focused." After she left, Caleb removed the violin from its case, carefully tuning it and running through scales to warm up his fingers. The instrument wasn't his grandfather's, but over the past weeks, he'd grown accustomed to its voice. A soft knock interrupted, His practice. Expecting Ms. Holloway, he was surprised to see Daniel Whitmore enter, dressed not in his janitor's uniform but in a well-worn but dignified suit. "Thought I'd come wish you luck," Daniel said with a warm smile. "Brought something. For you too." From his pocket, he withdrew a small wooden carving of a violin, simple but beautifully crafted. "Made this years ago when I was about your age. Carried it to every performance. Thought you might like to have it today." Touched by the gesture, Caleb accepted the carving. "Thank you for coming, and for everything you've taught me." Daniel shook his head. "I just helped refine what was already there. The music, the heart, that was always yours." As they talked, the door opened again. Principal Morgan and Ethan stood in the doorway, both looking momentarily startled to see Daniel. "Mr. Whitmore," Principal Morgan said, recovering quickly, "I wasn't aware you had any connection to this event." "Just supporting a promising young musician," Daniel replied evenly. Principal Morgan's eyes narrowed slightly before shifting to Caleb. "Mr. Williams, I'm surprised to see you competing given recent events." "My suspension was from school activities," Caleb replied. "This is independent." Morgan's smile was thin. "Of course. Well, we wouldn't want to interrupt your preparation. Ethan has his own warm-up to attend to." As they turned to leave, Ethan leaned close to Caleb and whispered, "Enjoy your moment on stage. It'll be your last." After changing into his suit, Caleb continued practicing, working through the most challenging passages of his composition. He was so absorbed that he barely registered the door opening again until a competition official cleared his throat loudly. "Mr. Williams, may we speak with you for a moment?" Caleb lowered his violin to find two administrators regarding him with serious expressions. "There's been a concern raised about your composition," the woman said, her tone professionally neutral. "Another competitor has suggested there may be some unauthorized borrowing of musical elements." It took a moment for the implication to register. "You mean plagiarism? That's impossible. I wrote this piece myself." "Nevertheless, we need to investigate the claim," the male official stated. "The competition has strict rules about original work." "Who made this accusation?" Caleb demanded, though he already knew the answer. The officials exchanged glances. "We can't disclose that information. We simply need to review your composition alongside the other students' work. This may delay your performance slot." After they left, Caleb sat heavily on the practice room bench, his confidence shaken. Even here, miles from Westwood, Ethan and his father had found a way to undermine him, to cast doubt on his integrity just as he was about to perform. He reached for his phone to call Ms. Holloway, then stopped. What if there were similarities between his composition and Ethan's? Music had common structures after all. Perhaps he had unconsciously incorporated elements that Ethan was also using. The thought was paralyzing. For the first time since beginning this journey, Caleb considered withdrawing, walking away rather than facing another public humiliation. His finger hovered over Daniel's contact information. The old janitor had seen it all, had faced worse discrimination in his day. He would understand if Caleb chose to step away. Daniel answered on the second ring. "Everything all right, son?" Caleb explained the situation, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. There was a long pause before Daniel responded. "Listen to me carefully, Caleb. Your music speaks your truth. Nobody can fake that, and nobody can steal it. The notes might have similarities. Music has rules after all. But the voice, the soul behind those notes, that's uniquely yours. But what if they disqualify me?" "Then you'll have other opportunities," Daniel said firmly. "But don't withdraw. Don't give them the satisfaction of seeing you doubt yourself." 20 minutes later, Ms. Holloway burst into the practice room, her usual calm demeanor replaced by focused intensity. "I've spoken with the officials," she said without preamble. "They've compared your composition with Ethan's and agreed they're distinctly different works, despite some structural similarities common to the form. You're cleared to perform, but they're still reviewing recordings afterward as a precaution." Relief flooded through Caleb. "So I can still play?" "Yes, and you should start preparing now. They've moved your slot up due to all the confusion." She checked her watch. "You're on in 15 minutes. Backstage, Caleb peered through the curtain at the packed auditorium. The competition had drawn a substantial audience, including representatives from conservatories and music schools across the country. In the front row, he spotted Principal Morgan sitting beside a distinguished-looking man who was speaking intently. To one of the judges, Naomi found him just before his performance, giving him a fierce hug. "You've already won by being here," she whispered. "Everything else is just details." When his name was announced, Caleb walked onto the stage with steady steps, positioning himself beneath the bright lights. The audience before him was a sea of expectant faces, some curious, some skeptical, some already dismissive. He took a deep breath, raised his bow, and began to play Grandfather's Hands. The piece opened with a structured classical motif that gradually incorporated jazz-influenced harmonies and rhythms, a musical representation of his dual heritage in the world of violin. As he played, the technical elements Ms. Holloway had drilled into him merged with the emotional depth that had always been his strength. Midway through the composition, Caleb risked a glance at the audience. In the third row, he saw Daniel, eyes closed, head slightly nodding to the rhythm. Nearby sat Ms. Holloway, her expression a mixture of pride and professional assessment. And in the back, standing rather than seated, was Olivia, who had come despite her father's continuing legal battles with Westwood. The sight of these supporters, each of whom had recognized something in him worth fighting for, infused his playing with renewed confidence. The final movement of his piece built to a crescendo that incorporated elements of his grandfather's favorite spirituals, transformed through classical technique into something both familiar and revolutionary. As the last note hung in the air, there was a moment of absolute silence, that precious space between performance and response where art exists in its purest form. Then the applause began, tentative at first but quickly building to a standing ovation from much of the audience. Even some of the judges were on their feet, though Caleb noticed others remained seated, their expressions thoughtful or reserved. Principal Morgan and his companion remained firmly in their chairs, their tight smiles suggesting they had expected a different outcome. Backstage, Caleb was greeted by Naomi's tearful embrace. "That was beautiful, baby. Your grandfather would have been so proud." Ms. Holloway approached, her professional demeanor momentarily set aside. "That was exceptional, Caleb. Regardless of the results, you've made a statement today." The statement, it seemed, had been heard. As Caleb and Naomi made their way through the lobby during intermission, several people approached to compliment his performance. A representative from Eastman School of Music handed him a card, mentioning their upcoming auditions for scholarship positions. For one surreal moment, it seemed as though everything was falling into place, as though talent had finally overcome the obstacles placed in its path. Then Caleb spotted Ethan and his father in heated conversation with competition officials near the judges' room. Principal Morgan was gesturing emphatically, his face set in grim determination. Whatever the judging outcome might have been, it was clear the Morgans weren't accepting defeat without a fight. The judges' deliberation room hummed with conflicting opinions. Through the closed door, Caleb could hear raised voices as he waited. In the hallway outside, Ms. Holloway had gone to fetch them coffee, leaving him alone with his thoughts when a young woman approached, her press badge identifying her as Emma Davis from Classical Music Today. "Caleb Williams?" she asked, extending her hand. "I'd love to get a few comments about your performance. Your composition was unlike anything else we've heard today." Before Caleb could respond, Ms. Holloway returned, handing him a paper cup of coffee. "Mr. Williams is waiting for the judge's decision and isn't giving interviews at this time," she said politely but firmly. The reporter didn't leave. "I'm particularly interested in your training background. Your bio in the program is surprisingly sparse compared to the other competitors." Something in her tone, genuine curiosity rather than skepticism, made Caleb reconsider. "I'm mostly self-taught," he admitted. "My grandfather gave me basic instruction, and I've recently begun working with proper teachers." Emma's eyebrows rose. "Self-taught? That's remarkable given what we heard today." She scribbled in her notebook. "What school do you attend?" "Westwood Academy," he replied. "On scholarship." At the mention of Westwood, Emma's expression shifted slightly. "Interesting. I believe Ethan Morgan is also from Westwood. He's been a regular in these competitions for years. Ms. Holloway placed a protective hand on Caleb's shoulder. As I mentioned, this isn't the best time for an interview, but Emma persisted. Has Westwood been supportive of your musical development? Their program has a certain reputation. The loaded question hung in the air. Caleb glanced at Ms. Holloway, who gave a subtle nod. His choice. The truth is, my performance at the school recital was set up as a joke, Caleb said quietly. They expected me to fail. When I didn't, they confiscated my grandfather's violin and later accused me of vandalism I didn't commit. Emma's pen froze mid-stroke. They what? Once the first words were spoken, the rest of the story flowed out. The discrimination, the sabotage, the ultimatum to withdraw. Emma listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but mostly allowing Caleb to speak his truth for the first time to someone outside his immediate circle. Would you be willing to go on record with this? She asked when he finished. This connects to some research I've been doing on diversity issues in classical music education. Before Caleb could answer, a commotion erupted near the judge's room. Principal Morgan was gesturing angrily at one of the competition officials, his voice carrying down the hallway. This is completely unacceptable. The technical requirements were clearly stated. Ethan stood slightly behind his father, his expression a mixture of embarrassment and resentment. Emma's journalistic instincts kicked in. "Excuse me," she said, moving swiftly toward the confrontation, and leaving Caleb and Ms. Holloway to exchange concerned glances. Within minutes, a competition administrator approached them. "The judges have completed their deliberations. All competitors should return to the auditorium for the announcements." The tension in the auditorium was palpable as competitors and their families retook their seats. Naomi squeezed Caleb's hand reassuringly as they waited for the results. The head judge, a distinguished violinist from the New York Philharmonic, stepped to the microphone. "Before announcing our winners, I want to acknowledge the exceptional talent we've witnessed today. Each performer brought unique strengths to the stage, making our deliberations particularly challenging." The standard pleasantries continued for several minutes before she finally reached the results. "Our third-place winner is Alexandra Lee, performing Paganini's Caprice No. 24. Polite applause followed as a young Asian girl made her way to the stage to receive her certificate and medal. Second place goes to Jason Miller for his interpretation of Tchaikovsky's Violin Concerto in D major. More applause as a tall, red-headed boy accepted his award. Caleb held his breath. Ethan hadn't placed in the top 3, which was surprising given his technical prowess and connections, but neither had he. "And our first-place winner," the judge continued, "for an original composition that displayed both technical skill and remarkable emotional depth, Caleb Williams, performing Grandfather's Hands." For a moment, Caleb couldn't move. Naomi gasped beside him, her hand tightening around his. Had he heard correctly? "Go," Ms. Holloway whispered, giving him a gentle push. "Go." Walking to the stage felt like moving through a dream. The applause surrounded him, punctuated by a few enthusiastic cheers that sounded like Olivia and Daniel. As he accepted the award, a crystal trophy and an envelope containing a substantial cash prize, he caught sight of Principal Morgan's thunderous expression in the third row. "Thank you," Caleb said simply into the microphone when offered the chance to speak. "To everyone who believed in me when I didn't believe in myself." His eyes found Naomi, tears streaming down her face, and then Daniel, whose proud smile reflected decades of vindication. As Caleb left the stage, he noticed Principal Morgan already heading for the exit, practically dragging Ethan behind him. Near the doors, they were intercepted by Emma Davis and another man with a professional camera, clearly attempting to ask questions that Morgan had no interest in answering. The aftermath of the competition unfolded more quickly than anyone could have anticipated. 3 days later, Emma's article appeared in Classical Music Today. Prodigy or Pariah, the troubling case of Caleb Williams. The piece detailed not only Caleb's remarkable win, but the discrimination he'd faced at Westwood, connecting his experience to broader patterns in classical music education. Emma had done her research, interviewing other minority students who had withdrawn from Westwood under similar circumstances over the years. Most damaging was her revelation that competition officials had confirmed Principal Morgan attempted to influence the judging through his connections, and that a review of previous competitions suggested Ethan's earlier awards might have been similarly tainted. The story was quickly picked up by larger publications, especially after James Franklin provided documentation to major news outlets about Westwood's troubling history of discrimination. "This isn't about one student or one incident," Franklin explained in a television interview. "It's about a systemic problem that has pushed countless talented minority students out of opportunities they deserved." Within a week, Westwood's Board of Trustees called an emergency meeting to address the growing PR crisis. Principal Morgan attempted to deflect blame to Mr. Reynolds, arguing that he had merely supported his music teacher's professional assessment of student abilities. But the narrative was already beyond his control. Several teachers and staff members, seeing which way the wind was blowing, came forward with additional evidence of discriminatory practices, afraid of being implicated in the emerging scandal. The final blow came when a competition administrator publicly revealed that Principal Morgan had attempted to bribe him for information about the judges' scoring before the winners were announced. This revelation triggered an investigation of past competitions, uncovering a pattern of influence that had benefited Ethan for years. 2 weeks after the competition, Naomi received a call from James Franklin. "They're announcing Morgan's termination tomorrow," he told her. "Reynolds submitted his resignation this morning. The board is issuing what they're calling a clarification statement, but is essentially an apology without admitting specific wrongdoing." "What about Caleb's status at the school?" Naomi asked. "They're officially rescinding all disciplinary actions and returning his violin. More importantly, the exposure has generated interest from several music academies. There are scholarship offers coming in." As predicted, Principal Morgan was publicly removed from his position. The carefully worded statement from the board acknowledged administrative oversights and promised a comprehensive review of all policies related to diversity and inclusion. But for Caleb, the most meaningful change wasn't in the institutional response but in the personal outreach that followed. His phone and email were suddenly filled with messages from scholarship committees, music directors, and conservatory representatives, all expressing interest in his future. Ms. Holloway helped him navigate these opportunities, eventually identifying 3 serious options for his continued education. "The Perkins School of Music is offering a full scholarship," she explained during a meeting with Caleb and Naomi. "Their strings program is excellent, and they've recently launched an initiative focused on diversity in classical music." "What about our housing situation?" Naomi asked. The eviction date was looming, and despite the competition prize money, they were still facing homelessness. Ms. Holloway smiled. "That's where the unexpected developments continue. James Franklin has been busy behind the scenes. Westwood is offering a confidential settlement, with no NDA this time, to avoid a discrimination lawsuit." "How much?" Naomi asked cautiously. "Enough to resolve your housing issues and create a small fund for Caleb's continuing education expenses, not covered by scholarships." It wasn't the systemic change that would prevent similar situations for other students, but it was justice of a sort, and practical relief when they needed it most. That evening, as they sat in their apartment surrounded by scholarship offers and housing listings, Naomi looked at her son with a mixture of pride and wonder. "Your grandfather used to say that music was the key that could open any door," she said softly. "I don't think even he imagined doors like these." Caleb nodded, thinking of his grandfather's weathered hands guiding his small fingers on the violin strings. Those early lessons had been about more than music. They were about perseverance, dignity, and the courage to be heard in a world that preferred some voices to remain silent. The next day, Caleb went to Westwood one last time to retrieve his grandfather's violin. The administrative assistant treated him with newfound respect as she led him to the office where his instrument had been stored. As he was leaving, violin case in hand, he encountered Mr. Whitmore in the hallway. "Heard the news," Daniel said, with a warm smile. "Perkins is lucky to have you. I couldn't have done it without your help, Caleb replied. Those lessons made all the difference. Daniel shook his head. You had the talent and the heart. I just showed you some fingering techniques. He paused, then added, Ms. Holloway mentioned something interesting. Perkins has approached me about teaching a masterclass next semester. Seems my name came up when they were recruiting you. Caleb grinned. You absolutely should do it. Maybe I will, Daniel replied. Maybe it's time to step out of the shadows. As Caleb walked toward the exit, he passed the music room where everything had begun. Through the open door, he could see students preparing for class, including Ethan, who was adjusting his violin strings with methodical precision. Their eyes met briefly, an unspoken acknowledgement passing between them before Caleb continued. On his way, outside, Olivia was waiting by the steps. I'm transferring too, she announced without preamble. Dad found me a spot at Perkins, said something about keeping an eye on their promised reforms from the inside. Caleb laughed. So I'll see you there? Definitely, she replied with a smile. Someone needs to keep you humble now that you're winning competitions and making headlines. 3 years later, the sleek modern campus of the Perkins School of Music buzzed with activity as students prepared for the end-of-year showcase. In a corner practice room, Caleb, now 18, ran through final adjustments to his latest composition while his mentor listened with critical attention. The middle section still needs tightening, Daniel commented, marking notes on the score. But the opening is powerful, you're finding your voice. Thanks to you, Caleb replied, lowering his violin. The past 3 years had transformed both their lives. Daniel had moved from occasional master classes to a permanent position on the Perkins faculty, finally receiving the recognition his talent deserved. Caleb had flourished under the school's nurturing approach, developing both technically and creatively beyond what either of them had imagined possible. Your mother's arriving tomorrow? Daniel asked, gathering his materials. Yes, with 4 of her classmates, Caleb confirmed. They're making a weekend of it. Naomi had used their settlement money not just for stable housing but to enroll in night classes at the community college, pursuing the nursing degree she'd deferred when Caleb was born. Her small apartment near Perkins had become a hub for study groups and potluck dinners, filled with the energy of second chances. That evening, as Caleb practiced in his dorm room, his phone buzzed with a notification. A news alert from the Classical Music Foundation featured a headline that made him pause. Westwood Academy announces comprehensive scholarship program for underprivileged music students. The article detailed the school's new initiative, launched under its new leadership, to actively recruit and support talented students from diverse backgrounds. The program included not just tuition coverage but private lessons, instrument access, and mentorship, addressing the systemic barriers Caleb had faced. He sent the link to Olivia, who responded almost immediately. Progress. Dad says we should be cautiously optimistic. The oversight committee he helped establish seems to be doing its job. The following evening, Caleb stood backstage at the Perkins Auditorium, adjusting his bow tie as he prepared for his solo in the showcase. Through the curtain, he could see the auditorium filling with families, critics, and representatives from major orchestras and conservatories. In the third row, Naomi sat with her classmates, all wearing matching Team Caleb pins she'd designed. Beside them, Ms. Holloway chatted with several colleagues from the Metropolitan Youth Orchestra. Daniel would join them after introducing Caleb's performance, a full-circle moment that neither could have imagined during those secret lessons. In the maintenance room. Nervous? Olivia asked, appearing beside him in her own performance attire. She'd become one of his closest friends and fiercest critics, pushing him to excellence while never letting him take himself too seriously. A little, he admitted. There's a recruiter from Juilliard here. They'd be lucky to have you, she said confidently. Now stop overthinking and just play like you always do. When Daniel announced him, Caleb walked onto the stage with the quiet confidence of someone who had found his place in the world. His grandfather's violin, now properly restored but still bearing the marks of its history, felt like an extension of himself as he began to play. The piece he'd composed for this occasion was called Maintenance Room Sonata, a tribute to the unlikely journey that had brought him here. As he played, he thought of all the moments of doubt and triumph, the obstacles that had nearly derailed him, and the unexpected allies who had changed his path. The applause when he finished was immediate and enthusiastic, led by Naomi's unrestrained cheers from the audience. As Caleb took his bow, he spotted a familiar face in the back row, Ethan Morgan, watching with an unreadable expression before slipping out during the standing ovation. 5 years later, the community center in Caleb's old neighborhood was filled, beyond capacity, folding chairs crammed into every available space. On a small stage, Caleb, now a Juilliard graduate and rising star in the classical music world, stood before 20 children aged 6 to 12, each holding a violin. Music isn't just about the right notes, he told them, demonstrating a simple phrase. It's about finding your voice, telling your story through sound. The children, participants in the Williams Foundation's free music program, watched with rapt attention as his fingers moved across the strings. Named after his grandfather, the foundation provided instruments and instruction to underprivileged children, funded by a portion of Caleb's growing performance earnings and grants from arts organizations that had once seemed impossibly out of reach. Naomi, now a registered nurse, moved among the parents, distributing information about upcoming recitals and practice schedules. The foundation had become a family endeavor, with Daniel serving as lead instructor and Ms. Holloway on the advisory board. After the lesson, as children carefully returned their instruments to cases that bore their names, a small boy approached. "Caleb, Mr. Williams," he asked shyly, "do you think I could ever play at a big concert hall like you?" Caleb knelt to meet the child's eyes, recognizing in him the same hunger for music, the same uncertainty about belonging that he had once felt. "What's your name?" he asked. "Marcus," the boy replied. "Well, Marcus, I don't just think you could. I know you could. With practice and heart, there's no stage too big for your music." The boy's face lit up with possibility, the same spark that had sustained Caleb through his darkest moments at Westwood. Later that evening, Caleb prepared for a special performance at Westwood Academy. The irony wasn't lost on him as he entered the school that had once tried to silence his music. He had been invited as part of their diversity initiative's anniversary celebration, a public acknowledgement of how far they had come and how much further they still had to go. The auditorium had changed little, though the portraits in the hallways now included a more diverse array of distinguished alumni and faculty. As he tuned his violin backstage, the current music director, a Filipino woman with impressive credentials, stopped by to thank him for coming. "Your story changed this place," she told him. "The work's not finished, but doors are open that weren't before." When Caleb stepped onto the stage to perform, he saw many familiar faces in the audience. Daniel and Ms. Holloway sat beside Naomi in the front row. James and Rebecca Franklin had come with Olivia, who was now pursuing a law degree while continuing her piano studies. Even some former teachers who had witnessed his original recital years ago watched with newfound respect. As his bow touched the strings, Caleb thought about the journey that had brought him full circle to this stage. The cruelty meant to diminish him had instead launched him toward a future brighter than anyone could have predicted. His music had become not just a personal triumph, but a catalyst for change, proof that talent, when given the chance to be heard, could transform not only individual lives but institutions. The last note of Caleb's performance hung in the air, a testament to perseverance, to dignity, and to the power of being truly seen. As applause filled the auditorium, he knew his grandfather was right. Music could indeed speak when words failed, could open doors long closed, could change hearts once hardened against possibility. And somewhere in the audience, a young student, with dreams of their own, listened, and believed that perhaps their voice could matter too. What would you risk to stand in your truth when the world expects you to stay silent? Caleb's journey reminds us that talent will find a way to shine, even when systems are designed to dim its light. If this story touched your heart, please like and subscribe for more powerful narratives that challenge us to see beyond our assumptions. Your support helps these important stories reach those who need to hear them most.